A woman screams, not because she's guilty, but because her body has been declared evidence of sin itself. In the shadow of the Inquisition, justice had a different face when it turned toward women. The accused weren't just interrogated, they were made examples of. Their bodies became battlegrounds where the church and state fought to control not just behavior, but desire, speech, and identity itself. Have you ever been silenced for speaking your truth? Have you watched someone you know punished not for what they did, but for who they are? Have you ever felt the weight of judgment simply for existing in your own skin? That's the world we're stepping into today. A world where iron claws tore flesh, where metal cages locked over tongues, where devices were engineered around female anatomy with one purpose: to remind women that their very existence was dangerous. These weren't tools of justice. They were instruments of terror designed to break spirits long before they broke bones. Today, we're uncovering 5 torture devices used almost exclusively on women during the Inquisition era, devices that reveal a chilling truth about how power punishes those it fears most. What you're about to hear isn't just history. It's a warning that echoes through centuries. But before we begin, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe, because this is the kind of history they don't teach in textbooks, and it's the kind of truth that deserves to be remembered. Let's talk about what happens when a society decides that a woman's body, her voice, and her desires are crimes worth punishing. The Inquisition wasn't just a religious movement, it was a machinery of control that ground through Europe for centuries, crushing anyone who threatened the moral order. But when that machinery turned its gaze toward women, it became something else entirely. It became surgical in its cruelty. Men accused during the Inquisition faced charges of heresy, blasphemy, political dissent. Women, they were accused of adultery, of witchcraft, of seduction, of speaking too freely, of desiring too openly, of existing too visibly. The crimes themselves reveal the obsession: female sexuality, female speech, female autonomy. These weren't just sins, they were existential threats to a system built on rigid control. And so the Inquisitors didn't just create torture devices, they created specialized torture devices, tools calibrated specifically to female bodies, instruments designed to punish not just actions, but the very essence of womanhood as society defined it. The breast, the tongue, the womb, each became a target, each a symbol of what needed to be tamed, silenced, or destroyed. This wasn't about extracting confessions. Confessions could be forced with simpler tools. This was about sending a message that reverberated through every village, every household, every woman who heard the screams echoing from the chamber. Your body is not your own. Your voice is not yours to control. Your desires will be your undoing. The accused woman became a lesson. Her suffering wasn't private, it was performed. Crowds gathered, neighbors watched, children learned. The torture chamber became a classroom where obedience was the only subject that mattered. And the most terrifying part? The accusations didn't need to be true. A jealous rival's whisper, a rejected suitor's revenge, a woman who smiled too freely, laughed too loudly, refused the wrong man's advances. Any of these could lead to the question that ended lives. Have you engaged in moral corruption? Once accused, the devices waited. Cold iron, heated metal, mechanical precision. Each one designed with a purpose that went beyond pain. These tools were built to humiliate, to dehumanize, to remind every woman in the crowd that she was one accusation away from the same fate. Now let's examine the instruments themselves, starting with one that made its intentions horrifyingly clear from the very first glance. In the world of Inquisition justice, few devices revealed the era's fear of female sexuality as clearly as the breast ripper. This iron claw wasn't used to extract confessions, it was used to make a statement. Women accused of adultery, seduction, or moral corruption were targeted with a device built specifically around their anatomy. The message was brutal in its symbolism. The very part of the body society linked to temptation became the focus of punishment. It wasn't just torture, it was a warning to every woman watching. The device itself was deceptively simple. 4 curved metal claws, sharpened to points, connected to a handle. Sometimes heated until the iron glowed red, sometimes used cold, relying on raw tearing force alone. The victim would be restrained, arms bound, body exposed while the claws were applied to the breast. Then the inquisitor would pull. The resulting wounds weren't meant to be survived gracefully. The tearing was deliberate, methodical, designed to disfigure and mark. Even if a woman lived through the ordeal, her body would carry the evidence forever. Scars that announced her sin to anyone who saw her. A permanent brand of shame that followed her through whatever remained of her life. But the physical damage was only half the weapon. The real power of the breast ripper lived in what it represented. Breasts symbolized nurturing, motherhood, femininity itself in medieval society. They were also linked obsessively to male desire and female temptation. By targeting this specific part of the body, the inquisitors weren't just punishing a woman, they were punishing womanhood. They were declaring that the female form itself was guilty. Accusations didn't require proof. A woman whose husband strayed might find herself accused of using her body to corrupt him. A widow whose beauty attracted attention could be charged with seduction. A mother whose infant died might be suspected of witchcraft tied to her inability to nurse. The logic was circular and inescapable. If men desired you, you were guilty of causing that desire. If they didn't, you had failed your purpose. Either way, your body could condemn you. The public nature of the punishment amplified the horror. These sessions weren't conducted in hidden dungeons, they happened in chambers where officials, clergy, and sometimes crowds could witness. The screams served a purpose. They educated. They warned. They reminded every woman present that her body was under constant surveillance, constant judgment, and could be claimed by the state at any moment for correction. And here's what makes this even more disturbing. The breast ripper wasn't an anomaly. It was part of a system. So, if you're wondering how far this went, how deep the cruelty ran, drop a comment below. Tell me, did you know about these devices before today? Because what comes next only gets darker. The breast ripper proved that torture could be both intensely personal and brutally symbolic. But the Inquisition wasn't satisfied with handheld tools. They wanted something more permanent. Something that turned the chamber itself into a weapon. That's where the Spanish spider comes in. The Spanish spider was the wall-mounted evolution of the breast ripper, an instrument designed not only to harm, but to humiliate. Women were pulled toward heated metal claws fixed to stone, turning their punishment into a spectacle for those who passed through the chamber. Unlike the universal devices of the age, the spider's design made its intent unmistakable. It existed for women and women alone. In a world obsessed with moral purity, this device enforced the belief that female bodies were both the source of sin and the object of retribution. Where the breast ripper could be carried, hidden, or stored away, the Spanish spider was architecture, permanent, immovable, built directly into the walls of interrogation rooms and dungeons. 4 or more curved metal prongs jutted from a fixed mounting, each sharpened and often heated over nearby braziers until they glowed with terrible promise. The victim couldn't be brought to the device, she had to be dragged toward it. Slowly, deliberately, while the heat radiated against her skin. The procedure was as theatrical as it was brutal. The accused woman would be stripped and bound, then positioned with her back to the wall-mounted claws. Chains or ropes would be attached to her restraints. Then, instead of the device being applied to her, she would be pulled backward into it. The heated metal would make contact with her back, shoulders, or breasts, depending on her positioning. The pulling continued. Flesh tore, skin burned, and the screaming began. But what made the Spanish spider particularly insidious was how it transformed suffering into spectacle. The wall mounting meant that everyone entering or leaving the chamber would see it, would smell the residue of burned flesh, would hear the stories of what happened there. The device became a monument to female punishment, a constant visual reminder that certain crimes only women could commit, would be met with architectural cruelty. The charges that led women to the spider were grimly familiar. Adultery, sexual promiscuity, corrupting men with their appearance or behavior, witchcraft tied to seduction or fertility. The common thread was always the same: female sexuality as crime, female desire as heresy. A woman whose marriage ended in scandal could find herself chained before the spider. A prostitute, even one forced into the trade by poverty, was a prime candidate. Any woman whose body had become inconvenient to the men around her was at risk. The gender-exclusive nature of the device wasn't accidental. Male prisoners faced whips, racks, and crushing devices, tools that targeted strength and endurance. The Spanish spider targeted what society had decided made women dangerous: their physical form, their capacity to inspire desire, their ability to disrupt social order simply by existing in bodies that others wanted or feared. The device was both punishment and propaganda. It announced that female flesh was guilty flesh, and that guilt required correction by fire and iron. Survivors of the spider, and there weren't many, carried scars that mapped their crimes across their backs and chests. These marks weren't just physical, they were social death sentences. A scarred woman was a marked woman, her history written on her skin for anyone to read. She couldn't hide what had been done to her, which meant she couldn't escape the judgment that had put her there in the first place. The punishment became permanent, visible, inescapable. The Spanish spider also represented an evolution in the psychology of torture. Where earlier devices focused on extracting confessions or punishing confirmed guilt, the spider was designed for education. Officials would bring groups through the chamber, explaining what each device was for, which crimes it addressed. Young women especially were shown the spider as a cautionary tale. This is what happens when you forget your place. This is what happens when your body becomes a problem. This is what happens when you make men uncomfortable. The heat element added another layer of terror. Women waiting in nearby cells could smell the metal heating, could hear the preparation, could measure the time until their own appointment with the claws by the glow of the braziers. The anticipation became its own torture, sometimes breaking prisoners before the device ever touched them. Many confessed to crimes they hadn't committed simply to avoid the spider, which, of course, was partly the point. In a justice system that claimed to serve God and truth, the Spanish spider revealed something else entirely: a deep, institutional fear of female autonomy, dressed up as religious duty. The device didn't just hurt women, it reminded them and everyone watching that their bodies belonged to the state, the church, and the men who ran both. Desire was theft, beauty was manipulation, sexuality was heresy, and the punishment was mounted on the wall for all to see. Not all torture relied on pain. Some relied on shame. The Scold's bridle, a metal cage locked over the head with a bar that pressed against the tongue, was reserved almost exclusively for women. And the crime? Speaking too much, too loudly, or too honestly. In an era when silence was considered a virtue, a woman's voice was treated as a threat. The bridle didn't just restrain the tongue, it restrained identity. It reminded women that their words alone could condemn them. The construction was coldly efficient. An iron framework that enclosed the entire head, secured with a lock at the back of the neck. Inside, a flat metal piece, sometimes spiked, sometimes serrated, pressed down on the tongue. Movement of the mouth caused immediate pain. Attempting to speak risked lacerations, bleeding, or in cases of spiked versions, piercing through the tongue itself. The woman could breathe, barely. She could see through the cage, but she could not speak, could not cry out, could not defend herself with the very tool that had gotten her there: her voice. The crimes, punished by the Scold's bridle, were revealing in their pettiness and their scope. Gossiping, arguing with a husband, criticizing church authorities, speaking at public gatherings, laughing too freely, cursing, defending oneself against accusations, refusing to be quiet when ordered, teaching other women to read, singing irreverent songs. The list went on, but the pattern was clear. Any woman whose words disrupted male authority, challenged social norms, or simply took up too much auditory space could find herself bridled. What made this device particularly insidious was how it transformed the victim into a walking lesson. Women wearing the bridle weren't locked away in dungeons. They were paraded through streets, led by chains through market squares, forced to stand in public spaces for hours or even days. Neighbors threw refuse. Children mocked. Other women looked away, terrified of association. The message wasn't subtle. This is what happens when women forget that silence is their safest position. The public humiliation served multiple purposes. It punished the individual woman while simultaneously controlling every other woman who witnessed it. Mothers would point out bridled women to daughters as cautionary tales. Husbands would threaten wives with the bridle if they spoke out of turn. The device became shorthand for acceptable femininity. If you ended up in the bridle, you had failed at being a proper woman. Your punishment was evidence of your defectiveness. But beyond the social control, the Scold's bridle attacked something even more fundamental: identity itself. Speech is how we assert our existence, defend our truth, connect with others, express pain, demand justice. Take away speech and you don't just silence a person, you begin to erase them. The woman in the bridle couldn't explain her side of the story, couldn't plead her case, couldn't comfort her children if they were brought to watch, couldn't pray aloud, couldn't even scream when the pain became unbearable. She became voiceless in the most literal sense, reduced to an object lesson in female compliance. The psychological damage often outlasted the physical. Women released from the bridle frequently never spoke at the same volume again. They developed stutters, selective mutism, or simply chose permanent silence as the safer option. The fear of being bridled again was enough to kill their voices without the device ever being reapplied. In this way, the Scold's bridle achieved its true purpose. It didn't just punish speech, it prevented future speech through internalized terror. The gendered nature of this punishment was absolute. Men who caused disruption through speech faced fines, short imprisonments, or public debates. Women who did the same faced the cage. The implication was inescapable. Male speech was civic participation, even when disruptive. Female speech was inherently transgressive, inherently dangerous, inherently in need of mechanical restraint. Some bridles featured additional cruelties. Bells attached to the framework that rang with every movement of the head, ensuring the victim could never forget her confinement and that everyone nearby was constantly reminded of her presence. Masks that covered the face entirely, dehumanizing the wearer. Extensions that forced the head into uncomfortable positions, adding physical pain to the psychological torment. Each variation emphasized the same core belief. A woman's voice was not her own to use freely. The Scold's bridle also revealed how thoroughly society had convinced itself that female speech was a form of violence against men. A wife who argued back was assaulting her husband's authority. A woman who criticized church doctrine was attacking God's representatives. A mother who taught her daughters to speak up was corrupting the next generation. The bridle wasn't seen as cruel by those who used it, it was seen as necessary defense against a very real threat. That threat was women refusing to stay quiet. Here's something to think about. How many times have you seen women today told to lower their voices, stop being emotional, or just stay quiet? Drop a comment and let me know, because what we're about to discuss next shows that silencing women's voices was only one part of the equation. The Inquisition had tools for every aspect of female existence they wanted to control. If the Scold's bridle policed what came out of women's bodies, the next device we'll examine policed what went in and what those bodies were accused of desiring. The pair of anguish was a mechanical device with expanding metal petals, but it's the vaginal version that marks it as one of the most targeted instruments of female punishment in Inquisition-era Europe. Women accused of adultery, illicit desire, or witchcraft of the body were subjected to this tool, whose purpose was never truth, only domination. Its threat alone was often enough to break a prisoner's spirit. For many women, the terror of what the pair represented was as powerful as the device itself. The mechanics were simple, which somehow made them more horrifying. A pear-shaped metal bulb, segmented into sections that could be expanded by turning a screw at the base. The device would be inserted into the vaginal cavity while closed. Then, slowly, deliberately, the inquisitor would turn the key. The metal petals would spread apart inside the body, tearing tissue, causing internal damage that was both agonizing and often permanent. The expansion could continue until the segments locked into a fully open position, making removal nearly as traumatic as the insertion. The accusations that led to the pair were soaked in the era's obsession with female sexuality as inherent sin. Adultery topped the list, but the definition was broad enough to catch almost anyone. A woman whose husband suspected infidelity. A widow who took a lover. An unmarried woman who was sexually active. But it went further. Women accused of excessive desire, of initiating sexual contact with their husbands too frequently, of experiencing pleasure during intercourse, of failing to produce children. The body itself became evidence, desire became heresy, and the punishment targeted the anatomical source of that supposed crime. Witchcraft charges often centered on sexuality as well, bewitching men to desire them, using their bodies to steal male vitality or virility, engaging in sexual acts with demons, causing impotence in husbands through vaginal sorcery. These accusations sound absurd now, but in an era where female sexuality was so deeply feared and misunderstood, they carried the weight of legitimate charges, and they carried sentences that involved the pair. What made this device particularly devastating was its intimate violation. Other torture devices attacked external flesh, visible, comprehensible injuries that observers could witness and understand. The pair operated internally. The damage was hidden, private, unspeakable. Women who survived couldn't easily describe what had been done to them, partly because of physical trauma and partly because discussing their own genitalia was itself transgressive. The silence around the pair's effects added another layer of isolation to victims' suffering. The psychological warfare was calculated. Often, the pair would be shown to accused women before any physical torture began. Inquisitors would demonstrate how it worked, explaining in clinical detail what would happen once it was inserted and expanded. Many women confessed immediately upon seeing the device, willing to admit to anything: adultery, witchcraft, conspiracy, rather than face the pair. Those confessions were recorded as evidence of guilt, validating the very accusations that had been forced through terror. But even confession didn't always prevent the pair's use. In some cases, it was applied anyway as punishment for the confirmed crime. In others, women who recanted their forced confessions would be threatened with the pair to ensure they maintained their guilty plea. The device became both interrogation tool and punishment, both threat and reality, both prevention and retribution. Its versatility in service of control was part of its design. The long-term damage from the pair was catastrophic. Internal tearing led to infections that antibiotics wouldn't exist to treat for centuries. Permanent scarring made future intercourse agonizing or impossible. Damage to reproductive organs meant many survivors could never bear children, which, in a society that measured women's value partly by fertility, meant social death on top of physical trauma. Some women died from the injuries directly. Others died slowly from complications. Many wished they had died, trapped in bodies that had become sites of permanent pain. The pair also revealed the Inquisition's view of female anatomy as inherently suspicious. The vagina was simultaneously the source of life and the gateway to sin. It was necessary for reproduction but dangerous in its capacity for pleasure. It belonged to husbands but was constantly under surveillance by church and state. The pair punished this anatomical crime directly, asserting that women's bodies were not their own, they were resources to be controlled, corrected, and if necessary, destroyed in service of moral order. There's a particular cruelty in how the pair targeted desire itself. Not just the act of adultery, but the capacity for wanting. Women accused of excessive lust or unnatural appetite faced the pair as correction for feelings that might never have led to actions. The thought, the desire, the potential, these were enough. The device served as physical erasure of female sexuality, a literal mechanical intervention to destroy what society feared most: women who wanted things for themselves. The pair of anguish wasn't used as frequently as some other devices, partly because of its specificity and partly because the threat of it was so effective that actual use became less necessary. But its existence in the Inquisition's arsenal spoke volumes. It announced that no part of a woman's body was safe from scrutiny, judgment, and violent correction. From her voice to her breasts to her most intimate anatomy, everything was subject to the state's claim of ownership. The shame flail was a deceptively small whip used for punishing women charged with moral offenses, anything from adultery to immodest behavior. Unlike the harsher scourges used on men, this lighter flail was designed as a public lesson. Women were led through streets or courtyards while the symbolic blows fell, each one reinforcing society's rigid expectations of femininity. It wasn't meant to kill, it was meant to control. And for many women, the humiliation was a punishment that lingered far longer than the pain. At first glance, the shame flail seems almost merciful compared to the devices we've examined, a small whip with multiple leather or rope strands, sometimes featuring knots or light metal tips. The strikes left welts and bruises, but rarely caused permanent scarring or life-threatening injuries. Women punished with the flail typically survived. They could walk away. They could return to their lives. But the cruelty wasn't in the physical damage, it was in the performance. The ritual was carefully choreographed for maximum humiliation. The accused woman would be stripped to the waist or forced into thin, degrading clothing that exposed her back and shoulders. Her hands would be bound in front of her. Then she would be led through the town slowly, deliberately, while an official followed behind, delivering strikes with the flail at regular intervals. The procession would pause at significant locations: the church steps, the market square, the home of the accuser, the woman's own doorstep. At each stop, the charges would be read aloud, and additional lashes would fall while the community watched. The charges themselves were a catalogue of female existence deemed unacceptable. Adultery, yes, but also dressing immodestly, dancing too freely at festivals, laughing loudly in public, refusing a marriage proposal, spending time alone with men who weren't family members, working in trades considered inappropriate for women, drinking in taverns, walking without a male escort, being seen in areas of town where decent women didn't go. The variety of offences proved that the flail wasn't about specific crimes, it was about enforcing comprehensive control over women's movements, behaviours and choices. What made the shame flail particularly effective was how it weaponized community. These weren't private punishments conducted by officials and witnessed by strangers. These were public spectacles where neighbours, friends, family members and acquaintances gathered to watch. Some jeered and threw objects. Others watched in silent judgment. A few might have felt sympathy but couldn't show it without risking association with the accused. The woman being punished wasn't just dealing with physical pain, she was experiencing social death in real time. Children were often brought to watch shame flail processions specifically as education. Mothers would hold daughters close and whisper warnings. That's what happens when you don't obey. That's what happens when you forget your place. That's what happens when you bring shame to your family. The punishment of one woman became a teaching tool for the next generation, ensuring that fear and compliance were passed down through families like inherited traits. The gendered nature of the shame flail was stark when compared to male punishment for similar offences. A man caught in adultery might face a fine or brief imprisonment. A woman faced the flail and public procession. A man who drank too much was considered rowdy. A woman who entered a tavern was flailed through the streets. The disparity revealed that the offence wasn't the behaviour itself. It was women engaging in behaviour that suggested autonomy, independence, or disregard for male authority. The psychological aftermath was often more damaging than the physical. Women who survived the shame flail carried a different kind of scar. The memory of being stripped, displayed, and degraded in front of everyone they knew. Many couldn't return to normal life. Neighbours wouldn't speak to them. Family members disowned them to avoid contamination by association. Employment became impossible. Who would hire a woman marked by public punishment? Some women left their towns entirely, becoming wanderers and outcasts. Others internalized the shame so deeply that they never recovered psychologically, living the rest of their lives in withdrawn silence. The lighter nature of the flail was part of its design. By not killing or permanently maiming, the punishment allowed the woman to continue living as a walking reminder of what happened to those who transgressed. She became a cautionary tale with a pulse, a living advertisement for compliance. Her continued existence in the community, now diminished, now marked, was more useful than her death would have been. The shame flail also served as a pressure release valve for social tensions. When communities faced hardship, crop failures, disease, economic stress, the flail provided a visible outlet. Women who had always been slightly different, slightly threatening, slightly too independent could be brought forward for moral offences and publicly punished. The ritual reasserted order, gave the community a sense of control, and reminded everyone of their place in the hierarchy. The woman's pain became the community's relief. Perhaps most insidiously, the shame flail trained women to police themselves and each other. Knowing that any behaviour could be interpreted as immodest or improper, women learned to move through the world with constant self-monitoring. They watched their neighbours and reported infractions, partly out of genuine belief in the system and partly out of self-preservation. If you could prove someone else was transgressing, attention shifted away from your own potential vulnerabilities. The flail created a culture of surveillance where women themselves became enforcers of their own oppression. The device's simplicity was deceptive. It didn't need elaborate engineering like the pear or architectural permanence like the Spanish spider. It needed only leather, a willing official, and a community that had been taught to view women's autonomy as a threat worth punishing publicly. In that sense, the shame flail was perhaps the most honest of all these devices. It admitted that the cruelty wasn't just in the tool but in the society that wielded it. Together, these devices reveal a chilling truth. Inquisition-era justice didn't just punish women, it policed their bodies, their voices, and even their identities. The torture chamber wasn't only about breaking the accused, it was about enforcing obedience on every woman who lived, in fear of following. 5 devices. 5 different ways to target what society feared most: female autonomy in all its forms. The breast ripper attacked sexuality and physical form. The Spanish spider turned punishment into permanent architectural warning. The Scold's bridle silenced voices and erased identity. The pear of anguish violated the most intimate spaces of the female body. The shame flail weaponized community itself against women who stepped outside narrow boundaries of acceptable behavior. But the pattern runs deeper than the individual tools. These devices existed within a system that had convinced itself that women's bodies were inherently dangerous. That female desire was a form of witchcraft, that women's voices disrupted divine order. That independence was a moral failing, requiring violent correction. The torture wasn't random sadism, it was systematic enforcement of a worldview where women's primary obligation was obedience, and anything else was heresy. What makes this history so important to understand is how it reveals the infrastructure of gendered control. These weren't isolated incidents of individual cruelty. They were sanctioned, standardized, manufactured tools of state power backed by religious authority and community participation. Blacksmiths forged the devices. Officials operated them. Crowds gathered to watch. Churches provided theological justification. Families taught children that this was normal, necessary, just. The entire society collaborated in the project of controlling women through terror. And here's the part we can't ignore. The echoes remain. When women today are told to lower their voices, dress differently, smile more, take up less space, these aren't new ideas. They're descendants of the same ideology that built the Scold's Bridle. When women's reproductive choices are legislated by others, it's not so different from the belief system that created the pear of anguish. When women are shamed publicly for their sexual choices while men face no equivalent judgment, the shame flail's logic still operates. The devices are gone, but the psychology that invented them continues in modified forms. Understanding this history gives us language for patterns we might otherwise struggle to name. It shows us that controlling women's bodies, voices, and autonomy isn't accidental or natural, it's constructed. It requires effort, systems, and community buy-in, which means it can also be resisted, dismantled, and replaced with something different. The women who survived these devices didn't have that perspective. They couldn't see the larger pattern because they were trapped inside it. We can. The life lesson here isn't just about historical awareness. It's about recognizing how power operates through gender, how fear gets manufactured and deployed, and how entire communities can be convinced to participate in cruelty that serves a system rather than justice. These devices worked because everyone played their part. The inquisitors who ordered them, the craftsmen who built them, the officials who operated them, the crowds who watched, and the families who taught the next generation to accept them as normal. Breaking those patterns requires doing the opposite, recognizing the systems of control, refusing to participate in modern versions, teaching the next generation that bodies are not crimes, voices are not threats, and autonomy is not heresy. It requires building communities where difference is met with curiosity rather than violence, where women's full humanity is the starting assumption rather than something that has to be proven or earned through perfect compliance. The torture chambers of the Inquisition are closed now. The devices are museum pieces. But the question remains, What modern chambers exist that we don't see because we're standing inside them? What devices of control have we normalized because they've always been there? What voices are still being silenced? What bodies are still being policed? What autonomy is still being punished just with different tools? Before you go, I want to hear from you. What part of this history shocked you most? What parallels do you see in the world today? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if this video made you think differently about how power works, hit that like button and subscribe, because we're going to keep pulling back the curtain on history they didn't teach in school. Share this with someone who needs to understand why these stories matter. Because the best way to make sure history doesn't repeat itself is to remember exactly what happened and why. The Inquisition believed that controlling women required iron claws, heated metal, mechanical devices, and public humiliation. They were wrong about the necessity, but right about one thing. It required effort, infrastructure, and social participation. Which means that creating a different world, one where bodies are not battlegrounds and voices are not crimes, requires the same level of effort, infrastructure, and participation, just pointed in the opposite direction. That work starts with knowing what came before. Now you know. The question is, what will you do with that knowledge?